Okay, this video is for everybody who is thinking about or wondering about investing in multifamily property in the Bay Area. Now, I'm talking mostly about Berkeley and Oakland, but these general principles apply to most cities here in the Bay Area. Now, a lot of people have this misconception that you can purchase a tenant occupied property, do some type of owner move in, and live there for a few years and then rent it at market rate free and clear and take advantage of your investment that way. That is not how the system works in Berkeley or Oakland. So in a moment, I'm going to share with everybody a brief interview that I had with a real estate attorney here in Berkeley, and he's going to walk us through the steps on basic rent control laws in Berkeley and Oakland and what that means for you as a potential investor of property here in the Bay Area. Hey everybody, my name is Tommy Garabedian with Red Oak Realty, and I am here with a rent control attorney, a very prominent rent control landlord-tenant attorney based in Berkeley, California. His name is John Gutierrez. John and I have worked together with many mutual clients, and he's been able to advise many homeowners and tenants alike on landlord-tenant law, which is very tricky in the East Bay, especially in the cities of Berkeley and Oakland. So today, John and I are just going to have a very high-level conversation about this state of landlord-tenant law in Berkeley and Oakland. So John, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Tommy. Welcome, everybody. Let me just jump in and make a personal plug. Landlord-tenant law is just a very small part of what I do. I'm a real estate and land use attorney, but today we're going to focus the conversation just on landlord-tenant related matters.
Right, and John writes a mean set of CC&Rs if you are thinking of establishing an HOA association in the area. I know John personally does a great job. Anyway, so before we dive in, I just want to put out a brief legal disclaimer. Do not take anything that John or I say especially what I say on this interview as qualified legal advice. While John is an attorney, and you are more than welcome to reach out to John privately and dig deeper on any of these topics, what our goal is today is have a high level conversation about some ins and outs of real estate law regarding landlords and tenants in Oakland and Berkeley, and hopefully shed some light on some topics that are murky and there's a lot of misinformation going on out there. So John, my first question to you is, I have tons of clients who are looking at investment properties that are tenant occupied. And there's this misconception out there that an owner move-in is going to give them some type of freedom and a way to sort of hack the system by living in a unit for a few years and then being able to leave and re-rent their unit at market rent. And they go into this thinking that they're going to be able to cheat the system. Please enlighten us as to why that is not the case in Oakland and Berkeley.
Thank you. Nothing could be further from the truth than how you just couched that. Let me step back one big step and say that if you are buying property that is tenant occupied, if you are going to be a landlord, then, as somebody once said to me a long time ago, there is no room for being a weekend warrior landlord. You must be a pro. You must be on top of what the current regulations are, and you should be watching for what's coming down the pike, because even before the pandemic, Berkeley and Oakland have been moving aggressively to tighten down their landlord-tenant laws. During the pandemic, it's gotten even worse. Now the state is involved in regulating landlord-tenant relations, and I can predict with almost 100% certainty it's only going to get worse. So the specific answer to your question is that while Berkeley and Oakland have similar regulations, and I'll concentrate on the similarities, there are some differences, and you should pay attention to those in more detail at another time. But the general similarities between the two are that, first and foremost, the property must be eligible for doing an owner move-in eviction. If the property has ever been the subject of a prior owner move-in, or OMI as we say, eviction, then only the unit that was previously owner occupied, where a tenant was displaced, is eligible for a new OMI eviction.
Mhm.
In some extraordinary circumstances, it's possible to get 2 units or possibly even the entire building vacated if there's a large family and there's adequate justification for that. But first and foremost, don't assume that every property, and specifically every unit in every property, is eligible for an OMI eviction. Second, if you're going to do an OMI eviction, the rules are very specific and very technical and very, very easy to trip on. The form of notification, the form of communication with tenants is very specific. It's not, hey bro, would you move? It's not the back of a napkin. It's not an email informally asking or telling the tenant that you want them to move. There's a very specific form of notice that has language, magic language, if you will, that must be included in that. Go ahead.
What happens if you forget to check a box on that form? Does the city penalize you?
Not the city, but the tenant can. Basically, you can effectively disqualify the notification that you've given, and under some egregious circumstances, you could be sued and held liable by the tenant who vacates based on an improper form of notice. So, like I said, it's dangerous. This is a minefield.
Yeah.
The basic requirement, apart from the eligibility of a unit for an eviction, is that an owner, and we're talking specifically about the buyer owners, not the family members, which is a different category, but the owners, first and foremost, the owners who are giving the eviction notice must have a specific minimum ownership interest in the property. In Berkeley, you have to be a 50% owner of the property. In Oakland, a 33% owner of the property. So if 4 people are buying a 4-plex together and each of them only owns a quarter, none of them is eligible to do an OMI eviction. If you get over those hurdles and you deliver the proper form of notice and the tenant agrees that they're going to leave, there's compensation that has to be paid. Berkeley has a set of rules that basically requires payment to the tenant of roughly $16,000 to $21,000, 16 being roughly the base, 21 being the extra amount that you have to pay if the tenant qualifies under certain categories of disability, age, income status. Oakland has its own compensation scheme that's based on the number of bedrooms in the property. Oakland's amount is a little bit less than Berkeley's. So there are regulations regarding when those payments have to be made. If you don't make the payments properly, you can be held accountable for it. So when you get through all of that and the tenant vacates, under both Berkeley and Oakland regulations, an owner is supposed to occupy the unit for a minimum of 36 months. In some extraordinary situations where death, divorce, disability, job relocation, possibly going back to graduate school or the like, arises after the owner takes possession of the unit, then you might get away with less than 36 months. But the presumption is that if you don't occupy it for 36 months, your OMI eviction was basically a sham. And once again, you fall back into that category of potentially being sued by the tenant.
So let's say that an owner move-in, you stay there for 3 years and then you're ready to buy another single family home and you want to move out of your apartment. Can you just put that unit on Craigslist for whatever the market rate is? Or what do you have to do?
There's a procedure that you have to follow. Again, just to keep re-emphasizing what I've been saying, everything is very technical and rule bound. You can't assume that informality will prevail, even if you think you have a great relationship with tenants. As I always say to client, no good deed goes unpunished. So you got to pay attention to the rules. The basic rules are that the tenant that was displaced for the OMI eviction has the first right to return. That means you have to try to find and locate and contact the tenant. And the rent boards in both Berkeley and Oakland will also undertake that process.
Okay.
If that tenant decides to come back, then he or she has the right to come back at whatever their last rent was, plus whatever the annual general increases that are allowed by the local rent boards between the time they were displaced and when they're coming back. If you can't find the tenant, if the rent board can't find the tenant, or if the tenant is found and says, thanks, but no thanks, I don't want to come back, I've got a better gig somewhere else, you can go to the market and find a new tenant. However, the new tenant has the same rent restrictions that applied to them as the tenant that was displaced. So the process is basically, if the tenant doesn't come back or you can't be found or whatever reason they're not coming back, you have to find a replacement tenant who is going to occupy for a minimum of 6 months, preferably a year, and then voluntarily vacate.
Because
and it can't be an inside deal.
Yeah.
Right? It's got to be an arm's length tenant who comes in, stays for that minimum period of time, and says, I'm moving on. Then, currently, the slate gets cleaned and erased, and the next tenant can come in at market, subject to whatever changes in the law might occur between now and then.
Wow. So, you know, we are already at our time limit. So thank you so much for that.
Right.
For everybody who's thinking about rental property, make sure you educate yourself with landlord-tenant rules in Berkeley and Oakland. They are changing by the minute, but they are some of the strictest in the nation. So please educate yourself, protect yourself before you wreck yourself. John, thank you for joining me today.
Tommy, thank you. Stay safe, everyone. Talk to you later.
Stay safe, everybody. Take care.
Bye now.